So good afternoon. Thanks everybody for coming. I know it's the last session of the day and that's sometimes hard. At least it's not a Friday. Then there would be like 3 of you here, only because you didn't get the early enough flight out, right? So the talk today is Agile metrics, velocity is not the goal. You can probably guess what we're going to talk about. Mostly Agile metrics and a lot velocity. I am Doc Norton. I am the CEO of CTO2. It's a small consultancy out of Chicago. We do process and leadership coaching for organizations. And much of what I'm talking about today is the types of stuff that we actually coach organizations on. You can find me anywhere as Doc on Dev. Of course, we're at Philly ETE, and if you want to hashtag this talk, it's Agile Metrics. So there's going to be some interaction here. I will ask questions and be actually looking for a little bit of feedback from the audience on occasion, so just giving you a heads up. There will be no quizzes, there's no exercises anyone has to do, but I will be asking questions. And I'm going to start with, I think, a fairly simple question. Let's see if this transition goes.
What is the airspeed velocity of an unladen swallow?
What do you mean? African or European swallow?
Huh? I don't know that.
So my question to you is simply, what's velocity? Anyone, you can't get this wrong, I promise.
How fast you're going.
How fast you're going. All right, in an Agile context, anything a little more? How much can a team accomplish? Yeah, so I mean, it's basically, right, it is fundamentally work units over time. Right? I don't care if you use points or hours or ideal days, and by the way, that's a lie, I do care if you use those things, but whatever you use, and whatever length your iteration is, right? Velocity is basically that unit of measure divided by your period of time. How much work did you get done in this amount of time, right? But for those of us that have gone through a little bit of schooling, a unit over time is speed. Velocity has to have a direction, right? It's a vector. So velocity is the work units over time towards the delivery of value, which is something that we sometimes forget. Teams start asking questions like, should we put our bug work and other work into our, should we actually size those so that we can see them in our velocity? I would say, you could do that if you just want to get an idea of how much work is moving through the team at any given time, but that does not give us necessarily a measurement of our actual effort towards value, right? The reason that stuff's not in velocity is because it gives us an indication of how much value are we delivering. So that's a pretty simple definition, but what else is velocity? What are other aspects of it? So one thing that I think is really important about velocity is that it's a lagging indicator. Right now, fundamentally, we do a thing, we get a result, and we measure it, and we look at that result, right? And the thing about lagging indicators, there are many things about lagging indicators, but one of them is they're actually not good short-term predictors. Lagging indicators are fairly decent for being able to see long-term patterns, but they are not actually good predictors of what's going to happen in the near-term future. So while we can look at a lagging indicator and realize that there is an increase in spending almost every year between November and December, we can't necessarily use that to say how much are people going to spend tomorrow. Make sense? The other thing about lagging indicators, and I have this picture up here because this is an unemployment line. Unemployment is a lagging indicator. It is a lagging indicator of a downturn in the economy, right? We don't fix lagging indicators by addressing them directly. The way you fix lagging indicators is you address the underlying cause. Velocity is also a measure of a complex system. There are many things that are going on here, right? It's not just about hands-on keys. We look at kind of the typical process, and there's many different players, and there's many different loops, and there's a bunch of different things that happen in this, right? And then we have all these factors around, difference in story size and difference in story quality, and all of these things come into play, and that has an impact on our velocity. So if I think about this from from an analogy standpoint, right, I was trying to explain velocity and how it actually applies to Agile teams, and I was looking for an analogy, and it occurred to me there's something else that I think we're all familiar with that is a lagging indicator of a complex system we can relate to. That is our body weight. Your body weight is a lagging indicator of a complex system. There are inputs, there are outputs, there are processes that happen, and there is an end result. Now, when we look at this, thinking about our body weight, what are things that affect body weight? Sleep, diet, activity, genetics, right? Health, right? Do we have a particular pituitary issue or something else that's going on, right? So there are many, many factors that actually affect that. Does any given body weight indicate an individual is healthy? It does not. It is an indicator, but it is not the only, right? Having a particular body weight does not mean that you are healthy. I've met plenty of folks who meet a social norm for what we think you should look like, and they have extremely high blood pressure and other issues going on. And I've met plenty of folks who do not meet that social norm, and their doctor would tell you they're indestructible. So if any given body weight doesn't mean that you as an individual are healthy, does any given velocity mean that your team is healthy? And the answer is no, it doesn't. Right? And this is one of the problems with velocity, is it actually doesn't tell us enough for us to really assess, is this team doing well, is this team not doing well? Right? So I want to tell you a tale of two velocities. Bear with me for a moment here. What I really want to talk about is the way that we kind of try and determine what might the next iteration's velocity be. Right? So we're going to take a look at these two basically sets of history for, well, all right, disclaimer. I would never advocate for comparing one team's velocity to another team's velocity. Not under any circumstance, not even if you really truly believe that you have normalized velocity measurement across teams, and how the hell you did that, I don't know. So what we're going to do is, this is the same team in two alternate dimensions. All right, so bear with me on that. But as we look at these, there are a number of ways that we could determine what's the next velocity for this team. What's the next iteration going to be? What are some of those ways? What are some of the things that we do? Averaging, right? How many of you heard of yesterday's weather? So we basically look at, all right, so if we got a certain velocity in this iteration, the odds are good we'll get the same velocity in the next iteration, right? Because the thinking is that, today's weather is a good predictor for tomorrow's weather. Whoever came up with that did not live in Philadelphia. But if we look at yesterday's weather for both of these, what is our next velocity? What do we think the next one's going to be? It's 10, right? All right, so somebody mentioned averages, right? Using a rolling average. Yeah?
I disagree with 10 on the second because it's inconsistent.
Because of the inconsistency? Yeah. That's fair. So that might be why we use a rolling average, right? Because now we're actually getting kind of a spread across. We're still looking at basically a localized metric. We're not looking at average of all of our history, but we're averaging in, and so we're accounting for some of the variability, right? So if you use like Pivotal Tracker out of the box, it does a rolling average of the last 3 iterations. So let's just use that as our kind of our yardstick here. So for these 2 teams, if you use that, what is the next velocity? Yeah, so that's just whether rolling average turns out to also be 10. So something that I've seen teams do, and we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail later, but one of the things that I've actually seen teams do is use standard deviation. Right, now, how many of you are familiar with this? Right, so I used to go through, here's exactly how you calculate standard deviation, but it's a little dry, and the reality of it is you take those numbers, you drop them into Excel or numbers, and you highlight them, and you say, give me a standard deviation, and it goes, here's your number. So that's kind of the easiest way to do it. So if we look at these 2 now, right, that's average. Standard deviation, we start to see something. The standard deviation for this team is 0.7, and the standard deviation for this team is 3.1, which basically is an indication of the variability in that number set, right? So now, if we use whatever method we want, yesterday's weather or rolling average, because in this case they turn out to be the exact same thing, but we apply that deviation to it, we add it and subtract it, we get a range, right? And now we're actually seeing that this team, it's probably going to be somewhere between 9.3 and 10.7. This team is probably going to be somewhere 6.9 to 13.1. So we now have kind of a confidence. This is with 1 standard deviation applied, by the way, so that's like a 68% confidence interval. If you actually wanted a 95% confidence, you'd have to apply 2 standard deviations, which would get us to like a range of, 3 to 16 point something. But with this, we've now got a range. We can actually apply that to the burn, and we can actually start talking about, well, we'll be done sometime between this, this date and this date based on the data that we have today. It may be an uncomfortable conversation, but it's a much more realistic and truthful conversation than, well, it'll be exactly November 7th at 3:42 p.m. Right? We have no idea. So a burn with standard deviation might look something like this. The kind of faded line in the background is the actual, just a straight burn, and then the yellow around it is a standard deviation. You can use that to kind of project out. So I think this is one of the challenges with velocity as well is, like I said, it's not a good short-term predictor. So we're using it to say when we think we're going to be done, but it's actually not very good at that. So the standard deviation can help with that. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later as we look at some other aspects of this. And fundamentally what it comes down to is standard deviations apply well for a normal Gaussian curve, for a bell curve, when like you've got a center point and everything falls kind of evenly on either side of it. When that doesn't happen, standard deviation starts to become a bit of a lie. It's still better than just the straight line, right? So what's one of the other problems with velocity? When I look at teams, I'm going in and I'm talking to organizations that are, they're new, someone read a book or heard a thing and decided, you know what, it's time to install the Agile. One of the things that I know I'm going to get is my teams are going to go faster because I read this thing that said for a few iterations, they might have some problems, but then their velocity is going to normalize and they're going to get faster because magic just happens when you install the Agile. Well, what ends up happening then is there's this pressure from the organization, right? There's this need for speed. We know that you're going to get faster, so that is an expectation that we actually hold. And no matter how they present it, right? Management has a tendency, and I'm using management very loosely, has a tendency to start saying things like, hey team, I've noticed that when we started off, yeah, velocity was a little, we've been at 15 for the last like 3 iterations, and I'm looking at the burn, we're not gonna make it, but man, if you guys could just get to 18 for me, right? If you could just get me a few more velocities per iteration, we would actually beat the deadline by 3 days and everybody gets pizza. Now, have you heard something along these lines? It may not have been delivered quite that nicely. It might have been more along the lines of, listen, you lazy, but right, how many of you have been on a team where someone asked the team to just stretch a little bit and give me a little more velocity in this next iteration? All right. So what happens there, there's a couple of things that happen there. First of all, we basically invoke Hawthorne effect. How many of you are familiar with Hawthorne effect? All right. So I'm going to tell a story quickly about about the history of this. It is based in fact, but I'm making up a portion of it, so bear with me if you've read the papers. But fundamentally what happened here was an organization that actually made lighting was curious to find out what is the effect of ambient lighting on the productivity of people on a factory floor. And they had a facility at Hawthorne, so the Hawthorne facility. They said, okay, we should find out. Let's run a study. We're going to do a serious scientific experiment here. So they pulled everybody together and they said, listen, folks, here's what's going on. We've been monitoring your productivity, your throughput for quite some time, so we know what the baseline is. We want to run this experiment. We want to figure out what the effect of ambient lighting has on throughput on the factory floor. So you're going to notice some changes in lighting. Don't worry about it. We're running this study. Cool? All right, everybody get back to work. So then they increased the lighting on the factory floor, raised it much brighter in the room. What do you think happened? Productivity went up. Absolutely. So this is fantastic. More lights, more productivity. This is good for us. And somebody said, well, wait a minute. This is a scientific experiment, right? Shouldn't we test the the counter of this? Shouldn't we look at, okay, fine. We know what's going to happen because obviously more light is more productivity, therefore, but we'll do it to make you happy. So they lowered the lighting below the normal level. What do you think happened? Productivity went up. At which point they said, well, this doesn't make any sense. We must have done something wrong. And they scrapped the experiment and set the lights back to normal. And what do you suppose happened? Productivity went up for a while, and then it normalized back down again. So what fundamentally is the Hawthorne effect? Now, that which is measured will improve. I think really the truth is that which is reported upon will improve. The problem is there's a cost, right? Now, why did the productivity go up the third time when they set the lighting back to normal? The reason it went up the third time was because they didn't tell anybody the study was over. So everybody knew they were being measured. Everybody knew that changes in lighting was expected to have some effect on productivity. You look at this and go, well, this is great. I'm just going to tell people I'm measuring them, and then I'm going to keep changing the criteria so that they just keep getting more and more productive. But that would be based on the assumption that there is so much slack in the system, that your people are so unbelievably lazy that you can just continue to get a productivity increase with no other cost, right? Something else was going on here. People were missing lunch or staying late, or maybe even quality was going down, right? Something was happening that the productivity continued to increase, but we weren't measuring for anything else. The other thing that happens when we set a goal like that, when we start measuring and actually setting a goal like that, is we invoke GOODHART'S law. How many of you are familiar with GOODHART'S law? All right. So Charles Goodhart was an economic advisor to the Bank of England, and in a 1975 paper, they were talking about setting policy for the bank, basically regulatory for handling inflation rates, et cetera, within the broader England, right? And Goodhart gave a warning. He said, look, any observed statistical regularity will tend to collapse once pressure is placed upon it for control purposes. Okay, what does that mean? Fundamentally, what that means is when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. The moment you take a lagging indicator and you set a target for it, this is true in economics and this is true in many other domains. The moment that you do that, that measurement no longer means what it once meant, and therefore the target doesn't mean what you think it means. The moment you set a goal for velocity, you have changed the system, and you are not doing what you think you are doing. And what ends up coming out of this, what ends up happening often is these become perverse incentives. So with good intent, we set some target, but the result is actually the counter of what we truly want to be getting out of the system. Right? And we can see here exactly what's happening. We set a target for average call time, and sure enough, it's going down. Right? Great customer service, huh? So Deming tells us, look, stop worrying about, don't set quantitative goals. Look at the underlying causes. Look at the methods by which those goals are actually obtained and achieved. Look at root cause. So we look at velocity. One of the challenges that a lot of teams have, especially at the beginning, but sometimes indefinitely, is that it's highly variable. And because it's highly variable, it's even that much less of a good predictor for us, right? So we want to kind of figure that out and get that stabilized. And looking at the velocity itself doesn't tell us why it's variable. So from your own personal experiences here, what are some things that cause variable velocity? Carryover. Sure, so work that didn't get done in this iteration ends up getting done in the next. Dependencies on other teams. Yeah. Okay, yeah, vacation. So, just basically folks not being available to do the things that you had planned that they were going to actually be able to do. Yes, exactly. This conference is the root cause of all variable velocity. Bugs, defects in the system, changes in requirements. Yeah, so all of these things cause variable velocity. But if we look at this graph, can you tell me a story about this team? You can make one up, right? You can tell me that they have lots of bugs, or that people go on vacation, or maybe they're just lazy, or maybe they have carryover. The only thing you can really tell me is that the velocity actually is increasing over time, and so for everything's good, right? Because at least on average, it's increasing over time, and that's what we expected. So yeah, what causes variable velocity, right? So we talked about some of these things, right? Time just poorly spent, administrivia, things that distract the team from, kind of the core of what we're actually here to do. We talked about this one, dependency on other teams, right? It's another thing that certainly contributes to it. Poor story composition. Great big stories, little tiny stories, right? And that might actually be a factor in kind of the what do you call it, overflow, right? That may certainly be a factor there. I think we talked about bugs, right? Messy code in general. Just sort of as technical debt kind of continues to mound up, it gets harder and harder and harder. We may be spending more and more time on bug fixes, which don't count towards velocity, and then the next iteration we scramble to get a bunch of features done, but then we got to do a bunch of bug fixes again, right? That kind of thing. Another thing that actually is a major contributor that oftentimes doesn't get mentioned, and I don't think was mentioned today, is just too much work in process. Especially with teams that are in early adoption phases of, oftentimes Scrum. The thing that I'll see is, we go through a very good planning process. up front. Then we say, okay, here's how much we're actually going to load into this particular iteration, and here's how many folks we have. And then the next thing that happens is we say, okay, you're going to take these 3, you're going to take these 2, you're going to take those 4, and you'll take the other 3. Everybody, go. And each of us goes off and individually starts one of those cards, and it gets blocked because the database team actually didn't make the schema change. They said they were going to do last iteration, so that one's going to sit, and the guy that you need to talk to isn't available, and you're not really sure how you want to approach this, and right? And so those cards get set aside, and you pick up the next one, and then we have all of the things being done all at the same time. And when we get to the end, everything's 80% done, but nothing counts towards velocity. Right? So if these are root causes, we can agree that these are at least some of the root causes. How do we identify that these are actually root cause issues for us? Now, we might know it in our gut, but where can we find the data? And one of the things that I encourage teams to do is to just use simple scatter diagrams, right? To look for correlations. And sometimes there's interesting things that come out that help us to better understand what it is that's going on in our environment. So scatter diagrams, the first one I'm going to show you is actually not relevant to software, but I just want to kind of give an idea of how these things work. Every diagram I'm going to show you is basically simplified, abstracted. There's points that are aggregated rather than having the original diagram. But so this is, if we look, this is auto price by age of vehicle, right? Looking at this, is there a correlation between the age of a vehicle and its price? You can look at this and pretty much say, yeah, there seems to be kind of a straight line that goes down, right? This is a negative correlation. The older the vehicle, so the more years the vehicle has, the lower the price of the vehicle, right? So these are scatter diagrams from various teams. This was a velocity by complexity. Complexity for this team actually being measured simply as cyclomatic complexity, which is basically the logic branches in the code. There is a direct and known correlation between cyclomatic complexity and bugs. I cannot tell you that if you have a cyclomatic complexity of 72, you will have 4.9 bugs in your code. I can tell you the higher the complexity, the more bugs you're going to find, right? But what this team actually found, and this seems to be relatively intuitive, is when they were working in areas of the code that had high cyclomatic complexity, because this was this was the iteration that we were supposed to be working over in this area, their velocity was much, much lower than when they were working in areas where the code was not nearly as complex. So here we can actually see fundamentally messy code affecting the team's ability to get work done, right? And so now we have a visible case for, if we clean this stuff, we make that investment now, we can go this fast later. And now we can actually look at the trade-off, right? We can actually almost start to quantify it and say, well, if it would take us 2 iterations to fix this, within another 2 iterations, we'd make up all of that gap, right? This one was interesting for me. So this is a velocity by value. As you look at this, do you see a correlation? There's not, right? The dots are kind of all over the graph. You can't really identify any particular line. So my question to you is, should there be?
What do you mean by value?
Oh yes, that's a great question. Thank you. So what this team did, one of the ways that they actually prioritized their work was by value of the feature. So the product owner for every story card would say, basically, if this were delivered to production, we would generate X amount of revenue, per quarter. And of course, coarse grain estimates, but some assessment of this is more valuable than the other. So what we're looking at here is, basically dollars, and then again, velocity. So the answer to this question, should there be a correlation between value and velocity, it really is not necessarily. For this team, at least in theory, there should have been, because they were taking the time to actually assign value to stories, and it was a part of their collective agreement that they would work on the highest value stories first. And they were operating at least under that premise. The product owner believed that that's what was going on. But under the covers, what was going on was there were an awful lot of technical dependencies that actually, happened where we couldn't deliver this until we actually did these other things over here, and that wasn't being considered as we were prioritizing the backlog. So the reality of delivery, there was no correlation, but the expectation was there was. This allowed them to have a conversation about why is this and what's really going on here. Another one. This is this one was a little bit counterintuitive. Again, velocity by code coverage. Correlation, right? This is a positive correlation. The more code coverage they had, the higher the velocity. So we were finding that when we had the opportunity to work in the code that was very well covered, in those iterations, the velocity was higher than when they were working in code that was not very well covered. One of the number one arguments against, especially for developers to TDD or to write unit tests around the code, is it slows me down. But when we looked at it, it doesn't slow you down. Right? Maybe in that given moment, but when you go back in to work on that code, those tests give you that safety net, they give you that, that confidence and that ability. Plus, just having those in the first place typically means that the code is better composed, more malleable, more extensible, right? It has kind of the properties that we're really looking for if we're going to continue to work in this code base. This is a last one. So this is lead time by story size. So this team was tracking lead time, and they felt that the average was really high. And lead time, basically, they were just counting cards. They weren't looking at the story sizing, but they had been sizing stories as a matter of habit for quite some time. So we had that data. There is a correlation here, and this seems to make sense, right? So lead time is basically how long it takes the story to actually go from, hey, wouldn't it be nice if, to, hey, ain't that nice? And of course, the larger the card, the longer it took. And this graph isn't great. I should have done a line on this because there's a correlation here, but it is not linear. It is nearer to logarithmic. Right? So what we're seeing is if they took these 13-point stories and they found ways to vertically slice them into smaller stories that even summed up to the same amount, 2 5s and a 3, it got across the line faster than if they left it as a 15. Right? So breaking them up, they actually moved faster. So that's scatter diagrams and kind of things that you might be able to discover from them, right? And they're relatively easy to do. Yeah, please.
But would they sequence them so that you have less work in progress?
Oh, so if you broke it into 5 5 3, would you have?
I wouldn't do them in parallel.
You wouldn't necessarily do them in parallel. No, that is true, right? And that's part of like slicing, right? If what you're doing is you're basically breaking the stories into, we need to do the database, and then we need to do the mid-tier, and then we need to do the front end, you haven't actually broken the story up at all, right? That's still just one big fat story because nothing's done until all of it's done, right? So some of that's into how we actually do the composition. So one thing I do want to caution you with this. How many of you are familiar with Friedman's thermostat? So Friedman's thermostat, Milton Friedman, economic advisor, this time to President Ronald Reagan, and he was actually trying to explain fundamentally correlation is not causation, right? But the story that he told I thought was pretty humorous, so I'm going to tell kind of my own version of it. But the warning that he gave was, he said, look, here's the deal. Imagine for a moment that you are from a kingdom from long ago, and you live basically in homes that are made of stone or perhaps are like kind of underground, whatever, and that is how the temperature in your house is fundamentally regulated, right? So in the summertime, your house is hotter, and in the wintertime, your house is colder, et cetera. But you've heard of this kingdom in a far-off land where their homes are always comfortable. So you send a scout out and you say, hey, I want you to go and I want you to take a look at this scientifically and come back and tell me what it is that you find. So the scout goes out and the scout comes back, your head scientist, right? The head scientist comes back and is happy to report that there is absolutely no reason to use these things they call thermostats. And here's the reason. What he discovered was there were a few different factors. Right? The first was basically inside and outside temperature. And the other was this fuel consumption, this burning of oil. He said, I observed, and here's what I found. As the outside temperature increases, the temperature of the home stays exactly the same. As the outside temperature decreases, the temperature of the home stays exactly the same. But the more fuel they burn, the colder it gets. Correlation is not always causation. We can confuse these things, right? But it sure is a hint. It gives us at least a reasonable idea of what's going on. So if you're using scatter diagrams, I just want you to remember that, like, you may see a trend. Think about if this actually makes sense for you or not, right? Another thing that I actually do with teams is cumulative flow diagrams. And how many of you are familiar with these? When I first started giving this talk, nobody knew what they were. But all right, more and more folks know what these are. I'm going to go through this relatively quickly. So cumulative flow, what we're looking at here is a backlog. The items in the backlog are actually totally irrelevant. What I want you to see is that we have ready to start, in progress, in testing, ready for approval, and deployed. So we basically have 5 lanes that this team deals with, right? And what we do is every single day, at the end of the day, or at the beginning of the day, whenever, we count the cards in each of these columns, or we total the points, if that's what you want to do. We just write it down, put it in a spreadsheet, highlight the whole thing, and tell it to give you a stacked area graph. And what you're going to get is something that looks sort of like this, but won't have all the arrows all over it. What does a cumulative flow diagram show us? Well, we zoom in a little bit here. It shows us a bunch of different things. We can actually see the cycle time, which is the amount of time the team actually worked on the thing. We can see the lead time, which we talked about as the time from, hey, wouldn't it be nice if, to, hey, ain't that nice? And there are different types of lead times on teams. This is from the moment it enters the backlog to the moment it goes to production. You could also have a lead time that is from the time it gets picked up to the time it goes to production. You can have multiple lead times, right? You can see how much work is in process at any given time. You can see how much work is remaining to be done, how big the backlog is, et cetera. So we can see the scope increasing. We can see if they're actually kind of burning through that work even as the scope is increasing, and we can see how much stuff is being done at any given time. Fairly easy to read. So what I want to do, because I think this really helps, is we're going to go back and we're going to look at this team, and we've seen this chart before, right? This is our variable velocity team, and we told ourselves a bunch of stories about how it is that they got to this point, right? Might be bad code, might be handoffs, might be any number of things, we're not really sure. So take it this same team and the same data, but we're going to look at it from the cumulative flow diagram perspective. Deployed, ready for approval, in testing, in progress, ready to start. What is wrong with this team? What do you see when you look at this? So yes, oftentimes they're lacking work in the backlog, right? And in fact, at this point, they actually ran out of work entirely. What else? Yeah. There's a lot of stuff waiting for approval. It also turns out that there seems to be a connection between stuff being approved and the backlog size increasing. Their product owner is a traveling salesperson. So this individual's out on the road most of the time, meeting with customers, getting to understand how it is that they actually work with the product and how they use it. And they don't have time when they're out on the road to actually be approving features and all that kind of stuff. So when they get back into the office, they do 2 things. They blow through and rapidly approve as much stuff as they can, and add a bunch of stuff to the backlog. Sometimes they have to add it to the backlog before they approve it or at the same time because the team was completely out of work because they've been gone for a long time. So this is a scenario where, in most organizations, we look at this and we'd say, stuff's just not getting done fast enough, and we would push this team to move faster. And we would push this team to move faster. And that's not where the problem is, right? The cycle time is short. The lead time is long. And it's because of the approval time, right? If we got them to increase their, if they got 50% faster, right? In a, what is this? Like 1, 2, 3, 4, in a 4-week cycle, they would deliver 1 day faster. And it wouldn't matter, right? So this it can help us a great deal. Now I advocate for measuring many things, not just, your velocity and your cycle times, lead times, that type of stuff, many things. And the reason is we need to get a decent picture of what's actually going on. So this is a team. This is basically, this is a velocity chart, except I've made it an area graph because I'm going to overlay stuff on it. It just made it easier to read. But we can see, as we look at this, that the team starts off, and they got a certain velocity, and it kind of starts going up and up and up, and then it just and it falls off, right? And it kind of goes back down to where it started. So looking at this, we can tell ourselves a bunch of stories about this team, but we don't actually know what it is that's going on. Maybe they staffed up and then people left. Maybe. So what if we could also look at the code quality? Again, just psychomatic complexity, but I've actually inverted the number. So the worse the quality, the lower this line goes. Right? So now we can see that something's going on here with quality is really taking a dip. And it starts to kind of go back up, right? So we're getting a little bit better of a picture. Turns out this is a consulting company where everybody actually tracks their hours. So we can see the actual average hours spent, which by the way is on this axis, not this axis. They didn't start off with 12 hours a week and work their way all the way up to 16. Whew. They started basically at, slightly under, 37.5 hours in a given week, and work their way up to 50. And this is hours applied to this project. So they're spending, 40, 50, 60 hours in the office potentially for this, right? Now we're starting to really see a story here, right? This seems to be pretty consistent. Quality's going down. We're working more hours. The velocity's still going up. The quality's still going down. And then we get to this point where even though we're working the most hours we've ever worked, the velocity is dropping. And the quality is basically in the valley, right? And then we start working on this, the hours start coming back down, and the velocity starts to kind of normalize again. And I think if we projected this out, we'd actually see, this getting back to normal, velocity, either staying steady or, right? And ideally, quality continue to go up. The one other thing that we measured for this team was joy. Joy, who measures that? It's a little subtle in this graph, but you can see here, joy takes a dip before quality does. Joy starts to recover before quality does. What we found was that team joy was a bit of a leading indicator. How they felt about what they were doing and what they were working on gave us an early signal. And if we paid attention to it, we could start the conversations sooner, rather than somewhere down here going, okay, seriously, what the hell's going on, right? We could have the conversations much sooner and save ourselves, a good deal of time. How do we measure joy? That's a great question. So for this team in particular, what we actually did was we created a plugin for Git. When they did a check-in, they would just indicate basically from 0 through 5 how they felt about the code they were working on, what was their opinion of the code they were working on. We didn't even ask them, we never used the F word with this team, right? We never asked them how they felt. But their opinion of the code they were working on, and 0 basically being, I hate this, why do I have this job? And 5 being like, we should open source this tomorrow, right? So, and we felt that it was a fairly good proxy. And one of the reasons that we actually did that was what we were getting was a sampling as close to them having done the work as possible, right? I just finished working in this code. I'm now making a commit, right? As opposed to maybe asking them at the end of every day before they leave the office, how you feeling? Because I might have had actually a very good day, and then we were out of hot chocolate, or I found out that my kid is sick, or right. So so in that case, that's what we did. In other cases, I've seen companies use, and I actually have used things like Mercury app, which will ping you once or several times a day and basically ask you to rate on a scale of sad panda to happy panda, or 1 to 5 if that's what you want, kind of how you feel, right, about a particular thing. There's other micro-survey ways that you can do that. So real-world stuff. So this is an actual chart from a team that I was working with where we were looking at velocity with a standard deviation applied. And it just led to good conversations about kind of the variability and what's going on. I won't get into a whole lot of detail on these. Burn with standard deviation as well, right? Again, so we can kind of get a range of when do we think this will be done. We talked about cumulative flow diagrams and a lot of this stuff. So most of these graphs, at least the ones that are here, came out of a project that was written internally. We bumped up against their project tracking software, and through the API pulled out a bunch of data and were able to generate these graphs. So it was like a zero cost, aside from writing the software, then nobody had to do any extra work for this to happen. And if you are using an online tool or something along those lines, many of them today have these types of graphs available. I actually just saw, you showed me one that was out of Jira. Yeah. Which actually was pretty interesting with standard deviation, all kinds of stuff. What do we got next? Okay, so distribution chart for lead times. Now, this I think is really interesting, and it's something that I've actually just recently started doing with teams. So looking at basically at the end of every time we're done with an iteration, or every time a card comes across, just marking on a graph what was the lead time for this particular card. Not even worrying about the size of it or anything else, just tracking what was the lead time. From the time that we said, hey, wouldn't it be nice if, to the time that it actually got to production, what was that time, right? And marking it. And so there's a couple things about this. One, what we see is this is not a bell curve, right? It does not have an even distribution on either side. And that actually makes sense. The reason that it makes sense is think about your drive home or your commute home every single day. There is an amount of time it usually takes you, right? Let's just say that it's 15 minutes. If it usually takes you 15 minutes, can you sometimes do it in 12? Sure. Can you sometimes do it in 3? No, never. It's not physically possible. But could it, under certain circumstances, take you 2 hours? Yes, it could. So with a Weibull curve, we have this long tail, and this is actually what happens with lead times as well. And so standard deviation doesn't necessarily apply, and that's why, so what do we do with this? So first, I'm going to convert this into a bar chart, mostly because this tool couldn't do the graph I wanted without using a bar chart instead of the graph I originally had. So what we can look at here is basically we can very easily calculate the probability of how long will it take any story to get done, regardless of size. So what we do is you look at, there are basically 50 data points in this graph, right? Which means that that every data point is 2% of the set. So if we said the lead time was 16 on every card, we have a 100% confidence interval. Everything we've ever done falls within that range, right? If we wanted a 98%, it's 15, and you can just kind of follow this on down. So what I find interesting about this, see if I've got the right stuff. Okay, so if we were to, there we go. The median on this, by the way, is 7 points, right? So one standard deviation gives us this range, right? We mentioned before that a standard deviation is a 68% confidence interval. Where's the 68% confidence interval? It's right there in the middle of our deviation. So that's all good, it makes sense, right? These things line up perfectly. So now let's do 2 standard deviations, which is a 95% confidence interval. Whoops. So with a graph this simple, right, we can actually start to say, okay, based on the actual distribution, if you want a 95% confidence interval on how long it's going to take us to do any given story, it's 13. It's not 11. Does this make sense? So I'm starting to use this a lot more with teams because I think it actually is much more, it's much more realistic, much more healthy. But it's actually super easy to do. Team joy. So we talked about how that gets measured, right? And this is just a graph that we're basically using. So what we actually did was at one point they decided, like, look, there's a certain threshold that we'll accept, and then a certain threshold that is like, it's okay. This is where we want to be, and this is not good. And if the team joy ever gets down to this area, it's basically stop, drop, and roll. Let's start having a conversation about what it is that's going on, right? And of course, you want to watch the movement of it as well. But they basically had this radar that let them know that, like, whoa, okay, time to have the conversation. Doesn't matter if it's time for retro. Doesn't matter if it's time for whatever. Right here, right now, let's talk. Department joy. So this was based primarily on actually engagement surveys. But we looked at the engagement surveys and we broke them down into groups around do teams feel they have autonomy, connection with one another and the mission of the organization, and do we feel that they're actually focused on excellence, right? And so we could actually see both trending over time, how teams felt about those things, as well as every manager got this is very convoluted, but they got a radar diagram that showed here, this green line is you, and how your team responded to each of these questions. And the other lines are other managers in your group. So you could actually see how you compared to other managers as well as, and the whole point was not to get them competing for joy. The point was, you score relatively low down here, this person scores relatively high. This might be a good conversation for you two to have. You could go talk to that person about what it is that they're doing that they think is actually, and so we can actually have some shared learning amongst our leadership in the organization. So this is just some of the stuff. I got one last thing that I kind of want to share about metrics in general. This is a long-held and strong-held belief of mine. Metrics are not for managers. Metrics are for teams. All of this data should be shared with the team first, if not only. As the manager, you're helping them to have the right conversations to make decisions about what changes it is that they want to make. But as soon as we make these metrics about you monitoring their behavior, they're not monitoring their own, we're right back to the perverse incentives and all the behaviors that we talked about early on that we actually don't want to see. So I think we've got some time for questions and whatnot, for conversation. So what do you guys think? Cool? Bullshit? Good? Yeah.
Actually, just a question. You mentioned earlier that you don't think that defects should be tracked, I guess, not pointed.
There you go. Big difference. I think you should track the defects, right? You should definitely know about that.
Oh, yeah. I guess the question is that as a project that has a fairly good-sized backlog of defects, how do you then decide, how do you follow your velocity along with defects without pointing?
So I think there's a number of different techniques that we might use. We might actually load a certain number of defects every iteration and assume that those will on average take the same amount of time, so we can still look at the velocity. We could also have the conversation around there are going to be times when the velocity is going to be low because we just have to work on these things. The danger in it, Joanna actually articulated this really well the other day when we were talking, but the danger in pointing defects, right, and then actually counting them as a part of the velocity is you've now lost your ability to predict how much value are you able to deliver in any given iteration to the end customer, to the end user, right? It all starts to get convoluted. And I've had this back and forth with folks that say, yeah, but then I don't actually know what the real capacity of the team is because there's always defects. And right, we should probably look at ways that we're going to address the underlying issue of the number of defects that we have. Are we creating more? Are we eliminating them, et cetera? So it can be a rough transition period, but I would still, I tend to coach folks not to do that. I've seen organizations that point their defects and they seem to be happy with the results, but I think we miss some of the picture when we do that. Yeah.
Well, I like the fact you pointed out direction is important. And so rework is the worst thing you have on any kind of assembly line, whether it's software or real production line. So it's, if anything, it should count negative.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and if we don't count it at all, then it kind of does, right? Yeah.
Any suggestions then on how to approach it when you're on a team dealing with a legacy code base and your team's charter is fix all the bugs? We're the bug fixing team.
So you are the bug fixing team. That is a completely different scenario, I feel, right? So there's all the discussions around like who wrote this stuff in the first place and where the hell did they go, that they don't own it anymore. But I don't know. So that's interesting. I think in that case, I might actually then say, okay, let's look at counting the amount of defects that we get done in any given iteration, and start looking at their lead time and cycle time as well. If we wanted to actually, count the number of bugs and consider that to be a velocity thing, I guess that's, that's an interesting scenario. Any other thoughts on that? Yeah.
I would never count bugs if I was in a bug fixing team. I would use a Kanban board and show cycle time and lead time. Because every single bug is different. And I don't know about you, my record continuing engineering group, I could never predict how long it is going to take. So looking at the time box doesn't make sense. What we need to see is every time you come.
That makes sense. Yep. There was another question here, the plaid.
Yeah, so you were talking about units before. So in your ideal world, how do you go about judging the team's capacity and planning and all that stuff based around units?
I said I had an opinion about it. I do. I do not encourage sizing that is time bound. So, you can call it an ideal day, you can call it hours, whatever. And there's a number of reasons for that, but it fundamentally comes down to we're terrible at that, right? And so the abstraction of using like points and thinking in terms of complexity, I think is actually much more beneficial for teams, and it eliminates a lot of the really kind of bad conversations that happen. It's not always the case. So if you look at a place like Menlo Innovations, right, they do a very good job, and they estimate everything in hours, and they plan that way. There's very high levels of communication. There's high levels of trust. They've been doing it this way for years, and they have learned together how to make this work. So I'm not saying it's not possible. I still have some difficulty with the hour estimate thing. But I have seen places where it's been successful. Sorry, I didn't make people do the, I'm so bad. Now that the microphone's out, any other questions?
Follow-up to that. So
Yeah.
are you, is the team just doing planning at the story level, or are the stories then broken into tasks and you're planning at the task level? Or
I don't typically break down into task and actually plan at the task level. It's usually at the story level, right? And so a little bit of progressive elaboration. So you'll start off with you know, a much larger kind of a feature definition, if you will, right? And we'll say that's small, medium, or large. So t-shirt sizing. As that thing starts to bubble up through priority and it's at, or through the, you know, through our funnel, and it's starting to get closer to the team, we'll take a look at it. We'll break that down into actual, you know, thin sliced deliverable stories. We'll size those points. I usually encourage using like a Fibonacci scale for pointing. If you want to use, you know, doubles 1, 2, 4, 8, that's fine. What I'm really looking for is the further we, you know, like the larger the story gets, the larger the gap between numbers, right? It's a clear representation of our inability to know. And that's it. I usually don't break stuff down into like a task and estimate that. If the team wants to do that as a part of their actual execution, I think that's great. But when we start getting down to that level, we're really into minutia now that we're not going to get the precision or accuracy that we think we're going to get anyway. It just, you know, doesn't typically work out that way. So it ends up being a lot of extra work for no return. Anything else? So yeah, so for more, you can send a blank email to cto2@sendyourslides.com, subject line Agile Metrics, all one word. This will actually automatically email back to you a whole series of references from this. So everything from Deming's books to links to online material, blogs, et cetera, that's all kind of in support of this, how to calculate some of these metrics, et cetera. So, cool. Thank you, everybody.